Well, it's a few minutes past 7 o'clock, so I think it is time for us to bring our session to order. Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is Jacob Mazur, the Special Programming Manager at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this special member-exclusive event. It is a real pleasure to be able to kind of come together despite being under somewhat unusual circumstances. We were very excited to be able to present this eye-opening documentary, Shadows of Freedom. And if you are like me, after you watch a great documentary, you are left eager to learn more about the subject. To that end, we are lucky tonight to have a couple special guests with us. We have the two directors of the film, Amos Carlen and Aline Robichaud. And I hope you will, from your homes, join me in welcoming them. Hey guys.
Hi, Jacob.
Thanks for being with us tonight.
A pleasure. Thank you so much for having us. It's an honor.
Before we really get into digging into this film, I just wanted to say a couple words to those out there watching who wish to join in the conversation. On your screen in the YouTube live chat interface setup, you should see a chat interface on the side of the screen. If you have questions that you would like us to relay to Amos and Aline, please type them in there and we will get to them in the course of our conversation. We also welcome your comments, and so please put those forth as well. So let's get into our conversation, folks. Once again, I really want to thank you for this excellent film. For me, this was totally eye-opening. This was an incident that I was completely unfamiliar with in a campaign that I really didn't know much about, despite World War II being such a big part of our history. You know, this incident, as you allude to in your film, is not that well known, despite being both, you know, critical to the outcome of the war and also like a totally excellent story. So I guess one place I thought we might start is, you know, how did you guys find your way to this story? How did this get on your radar?
So I guess I'll take that, Aline.
Yes, please.
So so just a little bit of background. I actually studied history in university and specifically World War II related material, and I'd never heard of the story, and I knew very little about Operation Torch as well. Ultimately, the story came to my attention initially through my mother, who is a very well-respected scholar of North African Jewish history, and actually grew up in North Africa during World War II. And she came across this book in a little bookstore in Jerusalem. And so this book called The Jewish Algerian Resistance that we reference in the movie, in the beginning of the movie. And she was shocked after reading it that she'd never heard of the story. She didn't know anything about it, despite the fact that this certainly lay within her area of study. So she approached me, knowing that I'm in the world of media, and said, you know, someone has to make a movie about this. And she was initially thinking kind of a fictional treatment. And I knew that would cost, you know, tens of millions of dollars at the minimum. So I told her, you know, that I think it's a great subject for documentary. And that's really how it all started, was with this book that my mom found. And, you know, this is about 8 years ago that happened. And it was about 2 years ago that I met Aline, who was really instrumental in helping us put this movie together. And ultimately, we ended up partnering on the movie as co-directors and co-producers.
So, well, thanks for taking us behind the scenes there a little bit. If I have my facts straight, I understand that this was originally conceived as one in a series of films. Am I correct on that count?
You are correct. Yeah, that's interesting. That you must have done some good research to find it out. So initially, this was supposed to be and it might still be, but initially the idea was to do a series of movies about an hour long each that would document instances of Jewish resistance that really had a big impact on the war. And the whole project was called Butterflies in the Storm. As we delved into it, and as we, like with, so many things in our world, money really became an issue. And, we had a lot of trouble raising money to make this one film. And we basically just barely raised enough to make this one movie. And we felt that this was the most powerful of the three stories that we were going to tell, and the one that was the least known. And so we felt that it was best to put our very limited resources into telling one aspect of the three that we were going to delve into, and this was the one. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. I sort of on the broader subject of Jewish resistance during the World War II period. I mean, can you speak to like how this incident and how this particular movement like compared to other instances of Jewish resistance in the World War II era?
Do you want to speak to that, Aline, or?
Well, I was just about to say that one of the reasons that I was so enthralled by this story was just that, being a little bit of a historic buff as well, and having worked on a couple of other historic projects. I found this one the most intriguing because it's the least known of all the resistance stories, if you would, in World War II, and that it happened in North Africa. That's another really interesting aspect of it.
Right.
And maybe, Amos, I'll throw that back to you, and you can talk a little bit about North Africa.
Yeah, well, I mean, just in terms of the broader picture of Jewish resistance during World War II, there were obviously a decent amount of instances of that, and there's obviously a lot that we don't even know about because the overwhelming superiority was in the hands of the Nazis, right? But and I think the one that is the most well known for a number of reasons was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think that what we love so much about this story was that this was an instance of Jewish resistance that really did have a material impact on the war, and for lack of a better term, was successful in its aims, right? Because all the other resistances that people are aware of ended tragically, right? And this is one where, as a Jew myself, and my mother being a North African Jew, and if you could certainly, you can never really say for sure with history, but you could certainly say fairly definitively that if this resistance movement wasn't successful, that there's a better chance that there would have been another Holocaust or continuation of the Holocaust in North Africa, and ergo my mother wouldn't have made it out of the war, and I wouldn't be here either, right? So that it became a personal subject to a large extent because of that for me as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, one thing that was very... Oh, please.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and one of our historians said it so well. In North Africa, it was a chance for the Americans to kind of fail in a way,
right,
in order to then succeed in Normandy. It was a learning ground for them, not fail, but a learning ground for them, militarily speaking.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say it was a striking moment in the film. One of the historians that you interview says something to the effect of, how the Jewish experience during World War II is, generally depicted as, a victim experience, and understandably so. And, we can't downplay the horrors that, Jews experienced during that time. But it's also interesting to see, an instance where, they fought and they won, So I really thought that was an interesting element of the film.
Yeah.
Amos and Aline, I'm glad you brought up the subject of, the larger subject of Jews in North Africa too. And I was hoping, I could ask a couple of questions just to sort of get some context for, this incident that we had, dramatized in the story. I mean, so prior to this sort of German capture of France and, the installment of the Vichy government, what was the position of Jews in North Africa and particularly in Algeria like? Like, how integrated were they into society, and what kind of rights did they have or not have?
So the Jews in North Africa before World War II were actually very well integrated, and were actually, the rights they had were, in many cases, and in most cases, actually, for a number of reasons, but they were actually considered sort of a higher class of citizen than most of the Arab population in those countries, right? Which we make reference to in the movie. And then after the whole deal with Vichy, and the part of that deal was actually that the Jews lost all those rights. So pretty much, instantly after that, after the Vichy government is enacted, pretty much instantaneously, the Jews lost almost all their rights, and they weren't allowed to study anymore. Most of the professions that they were part of, they weren't allowed to be part of anymore. So and that obviously is what gave rise to this particular resistance movement in Algeria, where these young students, they really had nothing to lose, and they could see the writing on the wall that it would begin with that, and obviously the eventual outcome would have been the same thing that happened to the Jews in Europe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think somebody in the film said something to the effect of they knew that this fight was, a fight for their lives.
Yes.
Which is quite striking.
Yes.
You alluded to this a little bit earlier, but can you speak to sort of the steps that the Nazis were taking, during this, 1941, 1942, to sort of accelerate from just this sort of persecution and ostracization of North African Jews, like towards like the extermination efforts that we saw in Europe? I mean, were those actually underway in North Africa? Do you know?
Yeah. So I'll sorry, I keep talking here, but this is I can answer this personally, because I know that my mother who grew up in Tunisia, which obviously borders on Algeria, but she told me that during the war, she remembers her father, and this would have been around 42, that her father was made to wear a Jewish star and was actually forced to build a concentration camp. So they were actually starting to build concentration camps all over North Africa at that time. So I think, really, if Operation Torch hadn't have been successful, I would say it was probably a year away from, the concentration camps, turning into death camps kind of thing, or leading the way to death camps. So yeah, I think it was like, I think it was one of those, nick of time kind of situations where there probably wasn't that much time left for the Jews in North Africa.
Right, I see. Yeah. I mean, I guess sort of coming on the...
Let's say we can't forget that the resistance fighters, they didn't know how many there were in Algiers. This was going on for 2 years, where they basically pulled together small little pods around the city, and not really knowing how many would actually show up on November 8th, 1942.
Right. Now, were those pods sort of forming organically, or was there a sort of centralized organizing body, or how did that kind of carry out?
Well, one of the main organizers was José Abouker, the young 20-year-old at that time. Him and a couple of his cousins, and then a couple more people. But on sort of on the upper echelon of organizing these students, really young resistant fighters, were older. Rather, maybe you can talk about it, Amos, about the sort of people in command that were higher up from France.
Yeah, well, I mean, we refer to the 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 higher level people in France. So his name escapes me.
Me too.
Oh gosh. um, what was it?
Beaubardier,
It's been a while since we saw our own movie, I think. No, only Dastier.
Dastier de la Vigerie.
Yeah, Henri Dastier de la Vigerie was really the guy who, in a lot of ways, really started this whole resistance movement. And you know, we make references like, as much as this was a Jewish movement, and I really want to give credit to the Jews who were part of this. It wouldn't have succeeded if it was just a Jewish movement, really, right? So you know, we need to give a lot of credit to the French, quote unquote, traitors, right? Who went against Vichy, and Henri Dastier is probably the main guy, who was sort of this aristocratic person who was actually a Republican, who, you know, didn't feel great about sort of democracy and these kinds of things, but ultimately he realized that the bigger threat was the Nazis. And you know, so he's really the guy that spearheaded, and he had connections to top levels of French government, right? And
Right.
him and Juice were really the two higher level French guys who were really who really kind of spearheaded the whole thing. But you know, they connected with the people on the ground who, as it turns out, were you know, 85-90% Jewish, young students without any experience. And you know, they helped to organize the whole thing. So in terms of the pods, you know, the pods weren't aware of each other, but the upper echelon people were aware of that situation, and they knew that they had to do it in such complete secrecy and where people wouldn't know. You know, these pods were like 5 maximum people,
Right.
and we didn't get into this too much in the film because there were so many things. Like, we could have made 3 films, you know, with all the information that we had, but with all the money we had, we couldn't. So you know, but yeah, it was a very, very well planned mission in that regard, and amazingly, nobody tripped up, and at no point did anybody, you know, in Vichy or any of the Nazis ever really get wind of this resistance movement, which is incredible.
Yeah.
It is incredible. And what was incredible was the willpower of these young resistant fighters to really go through with it, because
Right.
they knew if they didn't, it would ultimately be death to them and their families.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that struck me, you know, in the section of the film that was sort of talking about the formation of the Algerian resistance, is how many people from sort of different political, you know, traditions or allegiances that you see coming together. You know, I know that Dastier that's the first in a series of bad pronunciations, I'm sure, but
that wasn't bad.
but yeah, I mean, he was a royalist, and then, you know, there was talk about communists and socialists, you know, coming together too. But, you know, you also mentioned in the film that, you know, there was cooperation between like the Muslim religious authorities,
Yes.
you know, so there was, you know, cross-religion, you know, collaboration, as well as, I think it mentions, like, between, you know, native Algerians and people who were, you know, essentially in one way or another part of a French colonial project. So I guess, I don't know if you can speak to this, but one thing that I was wondering about was, to your knowledge, did the experience of collaborating together or being sort of part of that resistance movement together have any like impact on the relationships between those communities in the years to follow?
Again, if we go back to history, not very long after the World War II, there was the Algerian Revolution,
Right.
which happened, I believe, 10, 12 years after that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amos.
Yeah.
And that was a whole different ball game. I think after World War II, and many French documentaries have come out after that, giving the history of Algeria and how Algeria became Algeria, actually,
Right.
and broke off from France. As any, as any young colonized, as all, countries have done with being colonized.
Yeah, and further to that, I think really, it's a very good question, Jacob. But I think at the end of the day, it was kind of like my enemy's enemy is my friend, because the Algerian Revolution that happened, where basically the Algerians said we've had enough of French colonialism. As soon as they got their independence, they kicked the Jews out, right?
Right.
So there weren't strong ties really made. Necessarily from World War II. I mean, I think from the standpoint of the communists working with the royalists, I also don't really think that they. I think at the end of the day, it was one of those things where everybody realized that the Nazis were a greater threat than anything else. Just like if we're lucky enough to get attacked by aliens tomorrow, we'll all come together, I think, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
but nothing else
lucky,
will bring us together, right? What will bring Republicans and Democrats together?
Yeah, exactly.
Other than
embracing
aliens.
each other, hopefully, for the greater good.
Right. So, I recall, you mentioned a little bit earlier that, when you'd initially started thinking about this story and like the early genesis of the project, like, the idea was floated as doing it as like a narrative feature, and look, I mean, the story definitely like has the makings of it, like once, especially in the documentary, once we get into the section where like the operation is actually underway, and we have, military officials like kayaking in from a submarine, and
Right.
people, cutting wires in the sewers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like really feels like a thriller, so I understand. I understand that there were sort of limitations preventing, you from doing that initially. But have you given any thought to like pursuing a narrative, like a narrative project for this story, kind of going forward?
Do you want to take that one, Aline?
As we speak, we're mulling over the first couple of scenes.
Yeah, it would be a very exciting project for us, and I think at this point, Aline and I are probably the world's experts on this story. Not to pat ourselves back, but pat ourselves on the back, but it's just a testament to how few people actually really know this story.
Right.
And we've been lucky enough to find enough people in the world that know something about it that we've learned from, and also sourcing that archival footage that we ended up using in our movie. To really learn about it. So I think it would be a very worthy endeavor. And, ultimately it would probably bring the story to an even wider audience if we were lucky enough to do that. But, give us about another eight more years and we might be able to do something like that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, speaking to that, I mean, there were a lot of interesting people who showed up in the film as as experts, and the archival footage was really striking as well. How did you put together that network of people? What was that process like?
Well, Aline was really the one who spearheaded that. So why don't you take that one, Aline?
I think it was a question of just putting it out there. And it's almost like Alice going down, the rabbit hole. You go from one thing to another, and that leads you to another and another person and this and that. And I have to say, the internet is a wonderful research tool to be able to do that. And it's just cold calling and looking online and seeing which other historians had done somewhat similar or have the
Seems to have paused, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are
Okay.
you still there, Aline? We lost you for a moment.
Yeah, her connection got bad there. I'll pick it up until she comes back. But
Sure.
because there's just for to that, there's an interesting thing that happened. Christopher Kolakowski, who at the time was the executive director of the MacArthur Museum. He was a great interview, and he was actually somebody that we only found. We literally contacted him 2 days or 3 days before we ended up um, meeting him for the interview, and it was because we'd come across an article about Operation Torch that was great, and he was interviewed as the expert in this article, and he just seemed to really know a lot about Operation Torch, and so we just kind of contacted him. Aline got on the phone with him, like I said, 3 days before we ended up there, because we knew we were going to Washington to interview one of our other interviewees, and Robert Satloff, and because Christopher Kolakowski was in Virginia, that was quite close to Washington. We kind of figured if we can actually get a hold of this guy, we'll be able to do 2 interviews in the same period of time. And so he was wonderful, and he ended up accommodating us, and he ended up really becoming an integral part of the film. So some of it is just kind of serendipitous luck, but then a lot of it, Aline can continue now, but a lot of it was a lot of hard research, and I think contacting quite a few people before we found the people that would actually say yes. And Aline, are you there? Oh boy.
We had Aline for a moment. Well, hopefully we will get her back in just a second once the connection improves.
Yeah.
But one thing I was curious about was, like, did you guys actually travel to Algeria? I think we have her again. Aline, are you there?
It's sporadic, I think.
Yeah, it's still a little difficult.
Yeah, I think your question was if Jacob, if I understood, did we travel to Algeria? Was that the question?
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I was asking.
We actually, surprisingly, I had set up a wonderful guy who does these tours about Operation Torch in Algeria. And he also was a journalist and very much involved in knowing about the story. And we thought, wow, this would be wonderful to go and to have him take us through it as we go through that night. Unfortunately, he contacted us, this was about, maybe a month before, and said, they're shutting down a lot. The government is changing, and there's a bit of an uprising happening. So I would suggest that you don't come because you might not get out, as it turns out. So we didn't, unfortunately, to our dismay.
Yeah.
So what we did, do you want to explain to Jacob what we actually did do to get that footage in Algeria?
Well, yes, there's a wonderful, again, through research and researching media, there's a wonderful, I guess you would call it a library of all this footage that the French government, not the government, but a section that is public and also a public domain with in the government or INA, and it's a wonderful research tool, and they have everything there that we got to find out, and we were able to utilize a lot of that footage that you see in the film.
Yes, so that would have been the older footage, but we did actually get some current footage in Algiers
Yeah.
But we found an Algerian person based in Paris who actually had a little film crew in Algiers and we gave
Yes.
them directions of what to shoot.
Right.
And as it turns out, we were going to have them go back and reshoot some of the stuff, but but they told us that we can't shoot anymore because people are being thrown in jail just for walking around with cameras. So we ended up having to use whatever we had and try to
Right.
make the best of it. But so we were lucky enough to actually get some, current footage of that series, which I think added a little something to the film.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Yes, we had a crew all set up, and we were supposed to go and shoot it with them. But that what we got out of it was what you see. A lot of the footage that you see, the current footage, was footage that we managed to get out.
Yes. So, now you mentioned that one of the people you contacted, or you made contact with in Algeria, was a guide who specialized in Operation Torch-related tours. I mean, and to me, that begged the question, like, for me, and it sounds like for many people around the world, this story is not that well known, and Operation Torch is sort of overshadowed by the rest of the war. I mean, is that operation like better known in other parts of the country? We saw also some segments from a French documentary which seemed to be honoring some of the resistance fighters that participated in the uprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say that Operation Torch is really not that well known, even in other parts of the world. Like,
Yeah.
I guess in Algiers, it would be better known probably on average than in the States, just because that was the main thing that happened in Algiers during World War II. But really, as we talk about at the end of the movie, or as our interviewees talk about, at the end of the day, Operation Torch was hugely significant for so many reasons. And I don't want to give away too much, I guess, of the movie, because that is a fairly big part of our movie is talking about that. But it's so important. But it really got overshadowed, I think, largely because of the fact of the that the Allies were fighting the French, right? And that becomes a very awkward subject for France and for Britain and the US and a lot of other people, right? So I think even in France they don't really talk about it that much, because that's sort of the beginning part of the war where they were still in this kind of gray area. But I guess what's nice about the sort of aftermath of Operation Torch is that ultimately it did lead to France becoming a full-fledged ally. Not right away, but it kind of started that path where France could join the US and England and Canada and the other countries in terms of kind of being on the right side of history, I guess.
Right. Now, if we can play with counterfactuals for a moment, I guess I was curious. We learn a little bit about some of the large scale like impacts of Operation Torch and this landing in particular, and the Algiers coup, in how that affected the ultimate procession of the war. But I guess I wanted to ask, just kind of with regards to the landing of the Allies initially, had the resistance's coup in Algiers not been successful, how do you think that would have played out? Like, what difference would it have made for that initial landing in North Africa?
It looks like Aline froze again, so I'll take this one. But basically, I think that as I think it was Christopher Kolakowski who said in the movie, he said that it would have almost for sure lengthened the whole campaign. It would have lengthened the whole war probably would have been extended by a year or two. I mean, and who knows really? I mean, there's obviously, it's a really great question. I mean, there's a whole range of outcomes that obviously you could point to, right? I mean, let's say the Nazis had retained control of North Africa and tightened their control of North Africa. I mean, to go back to what we said before, there probably would have been at least another 500,000 Jews who would have been, killed by the Nazis, for one thing. I think also, in terms of the worst case scenario, it would have been, I think, in terms of morale, I think it would have dealt a huge blow to the morale of the Allies. And it's really hard to say, it might, I'm just thinking out loud here, but it might have led to something of a disintegration between the cooperation of the Brits and the Americans, right? Because I think that the Americans would have felt really upset with the British, who, as we talk about in the movie, Churchill really had to twist Roosevelt's arm to go there, right? So let's say the whole thing would have blown up in their faces. The Americans might have said, well, forget about dealing with the British. Churchill doesn't know what he's doing. He's an alcoholic, whatever. Let's not deal with this guy. And that could have really been catastrophic to the war effort. And, who knows what would have happened, right? It might have meant that the Nazis could have succeeded. I mean, that's kind of the worst case scenario.
Right.
But I think no matter what, if it would have failed, I do believe that the war would have gone on for at least another year or two.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Aline? Do you have any?
I think you're right. I'm in your camp. I think it was imperative, really, that that the landing happened when it happened, and it sort of took the Germans by surprise, because their eyes were on Egypt. They were not looking at North Africa at all, and they had problems with Russia. So it was an opportunity for Britain and for the Allies and the Americans to come in when they did sneak into North Africa, that led them then to sneak up through Italy and eventually into Normandy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one thing that's like so great about this documentary is it casts light on like these, dimensions of the war.
I don't know if I froze there.
Oh, we have you back now, I think.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh,
It seems to be unstable where I am at the moment.
Well, we're glad we have you back now. I was just saying it was, right, it's interesting to think about like some parts of the story that, it hadn't really occurred to me at least, such as like, North Africa being a place where the Allies could develop experience and like logistical know-how that they would use later. And also like cementing the partnership between, the UK and America. Those aren't pieces of the story that, get retold, so much. I wonder, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, no, and that was actually something that was a part of the story that the more we learned about Operation Torch, the more we realized that we wanted that to be a significant part of the movie.
Right.
And we wanted that to be an important part of the movie, was to tell people about this campaign, which, it was the first success of the Allies against the Nazis, right? Vichy and the Nazis. And so that is very, very significant. And we're happy that you got that out of the film, and hopefully a lot of other people did too.
I wonder if I can ask you about a couple of the figures that we meet in the course of the film and sort of what became of them, after the incidents that we learn about. Particularly, I'm interested in Dastier, and also we learn a little bit about.
I don't know if you hear me. Do you hear me?
Hi. Are you there, Aline? I think we've lost you.
We lost her again.
Yeah. So
I am.
Yes. What was the rest of your question there, Jacob?
Can you hear me now?
I was interested to hear about Dastier and what became of him after the war, but also, we learn a little bit about what became of José Aboucar. Forgive me for my lousy pronunciation, but
That's pretty good.
I believe it's mentioned that he, has a sort of political falling out with, some previous allies, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that.
Sure. Yes. So Dastier, he was a guy that we'd never heard of before, and he popped up sort of again and again in the story. And I can say that we both Aline and I separately did a bunch of research on him, and we really couldn't find. He's a very mysterious figure because we really couldn't find much else about him. And we actually visited this museum in France, which we took some footage from, and this museum is dedicated to the memory of French resistors, right? So Henri Dastier, he has his picture there. He's mentioned. He's commemorated as an important part of the French resistance. And we asked them for more information about him, and there was really very, very little that we could find. So I think Aline found some stuff about his brother, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Aline? Oh gosh, her connection's not very good. So I think her brother was one of his brothers, was fairly well known as starting a pretty well-known newspaper in France. But yeah, Henri Dastier, we don't really know much about what happened to him after the war. José Aboukir, and this is a very interesting part of the story that we left out. Again, not to kind of cause too much. We tried to keep the story as straightforward as possible, but I think part of the reason why Aboukir is not as well known, certainly especially in the Jewish community, as he probably should be, was because later on in his life, and this is what you're alluding to, Jacob, he became quite a sympathizer with the Palestinian cause. And I think that kind of ostracized him from some of the Jewish community. If you look at his history, though, it does kind of make sense because, I think as much as he felt like the underdog during World War II, he probably also felt that, that I should support, or at least I should have more sympathy for the Palestinians than maybe some of my co-religionists do, because they're undergoing similar things as to what, the Jews were going through in World War II, or at least that's what he felt. So I think that had the unfortunate byproduct of, maybe, and this is obviously going back a long time, 30, 40, 50 years, but it would be sad if it was true, but, perhaps there were some elements of the Jewish community at the time that kind of suppressed his voice and suppressed what he, the memory of the amazing things that he helped to accomplish because of his political views, which it would be very sad if that was true. And I have no proof of it, but it was Robert Satloff, one of our interviewees, did allude to that. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we all know about the filmmaking process is that not everything winds up in the film. So one of the, questions that I wanted to ask you was, were there incidents or characters or pieces of the story that you found extremely interesting that just for one reason or another, were left on the cutting room floor?
Both Amos and I felt that there was so much intrigue and complexity to this story. We haven't even begun to go through the layers that we came across. And as Amos pointed out, we needed to sort of simplify it so as to streamline and keep it not so complicated, but this story is extremely complicated and filled with political intrigue, with different power struggles happening, on the surface and below the surface.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific example of, to your question, because as Aline said, there were a lot of things that we wanted to explore, but ultimately decided that it was going to confuse the viewer too much. So, can you think of a specific example, Aline?
Well, I was just thinking of we didn't really go into who killed the French, oh my goodness, what's his name? Again, names at the moment. The corporal that was killed, not the corporal, but the Marshal.
Is this Darlan?
Darlan. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Everything around his assassination is murky and rife with political intrigue, to say the least, on the American side, on the French side. We'd have to go years and years and years in finding out exactly what happened and for what reasons.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that was a very interesting part of the story that we did talk about, but you could actually make a whole movie on the Dalin deal and then his assassination.
Right.
As per our research, but we just kind of streamlined that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was a fascinating piece of this story, and we have
Yeah.
this sort of nebulous comment from I think Dastier's comrade. I think.
Right. Yeah.
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 Well, we're coming to the end of our time, so I thought one place we might conclude is, I was wondering if you could tell us about other projects that you're working on right now, and also where we can keep up with what you're doing.
Amos.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're actually working on two non-fictional series. One of them I'll talk a little bit about is we're developing a documentary on. It's a music-based documentary. My background is in music. I've worked for many years as a musician and as a music composer in film and TV. And we came across some very interesting stories of people in the music industry that are criminally under-regarded, shall we say? So we're looking to do a kind of short TV series on that, and then we have another TV series that we're working on as well, which is I can't really give away too much, but it's actually more of a current affair kind of lifestyle thing. So, but with an emphasis on history as well. But I can't say too much about that because we're just developing it and we don't want to give the idea away. But yeah, in terms of keeping up with us, that's a good question. We don't. I'll tell you what. When we have something more concrete, we'll get in touch.
We'll come back
with you. Yeah,
I hope you will.
Yeah. And we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you guys again for taking a little bit of time to talk with us, and thank you for this excellent film. This was a really illuminating documentary, and it's a piece of history that I'm glad is getting some more light. I hope it will continue to do so. And to those in the BMFI community who've joined us this evening or who tuned into the film, I want to thank you folks too. And, we're looking forward to the time where we can all get together again in person. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Jacob. We really, really appreciate you
Thank
for our film.
you very much, Jacob.
And to those watching at home,
Yes.
as you can see,
So appreciative.
well, we're glad to have you both. And for those at home, if you like what we're doing here and you have the means to do so, we hope you'll consider making a donation to BMFI. Much appreciated during this strange period. The information to do so is on the screen. So once again, thank you, Aline and Amos, and we hope to see everybody in person soon.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Have a great night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great night.